All right, welcome back, everyone. After that great opening session by Carolina, it's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce Jeremy Gallegos to you. Dr. Gallegos is professor of philosophy and ethics. He's been at Friends University since 2008. He earned his BA from Wichita State University and was awarded his MA and PhD from Purdue. He's currently division chair of theology and humanities for the College of Business, Arts, Sciences, and Education. His preferred courses are applied Christian ethics and critical thinking. He publishes on truth-telling, particularly in applied ethics settings such as entrepreneurial ethics and medical ethics. He also consults in his spare time, facilitating strategic planning sessions for various organizations in Wichita, and currently sits as vice chair on the Wesley Medical Center Ethics Committee. So an ethicist, an applied ethicist after my own heart, Jeremy. And Jeremy's talk is called Hume's Descriptive Psychology and the Artificial Virtues as Applied to the Philosophical Practice of Consulting. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Good. General nods. I appreciate that. Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm going to attempt to share a screen. I believe this is the one I want. Yes, I believe that is the case. You can all see a big giant red square. All right. So I do have actually a paper prepared, so I will be probably looking at it from time to time as I read through it and make some notes. Let me skip down here. So all change is easy. People just don't want to do it. Thank you, and thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I mean, I could end right there. That would sort of summarize everything that we get from Hume and the actual practice of consulting, I think. What I do want to line out here real quick is sort of a prefatory note of what you'll see in the slide deck. So what I will be reading from the paper will match, but you will see some discrepancy in color combination and some other things. And part of that's because in this, I want to relay to you Hume's theory, the descriptive psychology that's at work. Then I want to point out how I use that theory in my consultative practice with organizations in the area. And one of the things that's been nice is I have enough colleagues in the area. I get similar real life issues that they've run through and they've shared with me that sort of reinforces this approach I have. And then I want to give you a real life example or a case study using a facilitation process I use. And I guess I'll explain it real quick before we dive right into the paper. When I do this, I often embed a process improvement exercise where we use either paper airplanes or model cars. And the whole point is to, it's a manufacturing setting and we build as many as we can. And we run that exercise 3 or 4 times throughout the day. And there are various elements that I change in that to get them to the point of, oh, this is what's going on sort of psychologically, and this is how we can sort of move on in making changes or improvements or working together. There's a host of ways that I use this. So in terms of the paper itself, noted Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume often serves either as the beginning or the end of serious philosophy, as his descriptive analysis and skepticism destabilized the history of philosophy that was still essentially Hellenistic. Yet either as a continuation of thought or perhaps a revolt, he spurred on 19th century thought of utilitarianism and German idealism, to say the least. Even at the end of this idealism was returned to descriptive analysis in what we now know as phenomenology. All of that having been said, the intent here is not to really discuss Hume's skepticism or descriptive phenomenology. Rather, the aim is to employ this descriptive methodology. Moreover, there's a thread of thought beginning in his treatise, running through his vast compilation of essays, and ending in the inquiries that is fascinating in of itself. But while that movement is interesting, the point is to take what is changing in that movement and employ it with regard to what we'll explore as passions, both violent and calm. And as they sort of shift gears into not just violent and calm passions, but to language of sentiment and taste. And we'll say more about that as we proceed. So philosophers such as Hume regarded the work as a matter of description, not prescription. So he's not going to tell us what we ought to do. Hume never intended his philosophy to serve as the basis of any one's particular behavior. Rather, Hume's endeavor was to simply explain human behavior, human nature, and why people conduct themselves in the manner in which they do. That is, Hume was really just going to explain human behavior, not encourage a set of particular actions. So there's no moral oughts riding around in here. There is something to be gained, protected, or wagered in any and every decision. Many of our dilemmas pit ourselves against others or maybe even ourselves. There's a naturalism involved in this. Hume notes that all we really have to work with, quote unquote, are the perceptions in our own mind. These perceptions can either be forceful and lively impressions or faint ideas. Technically, simple impressions are just sense data. Simple ideas are merely memories generated from the sense data, and complex ideas are the work of the imagination on those particular memories. The complex impressions, which is sense data with an emotional component, highlights the self-interested nature of our processing. And this is precisely the beginning of the application of Hume's work to practical philosophy. Nearly every decision comes by way of self-interest first, which then can house a number of biases in our thinking. True, Hume does believe that we can and do feel for others as ourselves, but that could be merely another alternate version of self-interest. In short, perceptions of sense data with a component of emotional reaction sets the stage not only for the development of his moral philosophy, but really for any consultative process. Further coupling this belief that there's a great uniformity among the actions of men, which he states in the second inquiry, he sees in his views of passions can be overlaid on many current models of psychology. For example, reactionary passions that are similar across time and space may resonate with the psychological need theory of the direct passions. Some are violent with respect to intensity and reaction, as fear is a prime example. Coupled with something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, fear most closely fits a level of when basic survival needs are not met. Hume, of course, is not saying anything like this overtly. This theory simply just didn't exist. But consider how the treatise is structured, and his discussion of artificial virtues quickly follow this discussion in Book 3. Here it is clearly delineated that there's an order to the development of the artificial virtues. Property comes first, then justice, and finally allegiance. Additionally, the first foundation for these artificial virtues is self-interest. So fear of loss of individual resources might be the first driver in creating these rules. Indeed, this is a direct violent passion. This is a critical element to bear in mind and to begin with in philosophical consultative practice. Before moving to the virtues of rules and justice and how we do those things, it would be beneficial to look at how humans work and how these concerns can play out individually in the workplace. So quickly, there are three elements of Hume's sort of psychology here at work. One is the moral psychology of human behavior, individual human behavior. And we can extend that sort of moral psychology into group psychology. And for whom it really is a matter of sort of special political organization. That is, Hume often refers to this more in the arena of politics than, say, companies or organizations. But while there may not be kings or parliaments in your organization, there are CEOs, presidents, and executive boards and boards of trustees, and they actually may operate in a very similar fashion to political structures. And lastly, there is sort of an epistemic psychology that might be useful here in our change discussion. There are in Hume's work, obviously, challenges between the is-ought fallacy and whether there's any sort of norm to adhere to in process improvement and change initiatives, but they do not have to be fatal to change processes. So considering self-awareness and the passions and reaction and response, or the difference between reaction and response, this really may be about managing needs and motivations. There's a connection already between complex impressions of reflection, self-interest, and property. And I'm going to switch property to terms of resources. Resources refers or can refer to time and energy, and not exclusively just property in terms of money. And this is important in the consultative process. In short form, we have access not only to our perceptions and those two varieties of impressions and ideas, but we can break those down into subcategories. And the impressions of reflection are important here because that is the seat of the emotions and passions that are generated. Traditional explanations of Hume's complex impressions run along the lines of sense data laced with an emotional component or reaction. After some investigation of this emotional response, they are to be determined in the treatise. These are either calm or violent. The calm passions are often mistaken for some subversive view of reason, although that's completely wrong. Hume doesn't think reason works in any of this way. Calm passions are still sentiments, albeit they could be weak ones. They may function more like matters of taste, and not surprisingly, they're actually connected to the aesthetic taste. As one finds a painting to be pleasing, but has no motivation to buy it or steal it, they just appreciate its uniformity, its beauty, its shape, its color, its form. Violent passions, on the other hand, do have more motivation behind it, and it's the source of the passions of self-interest. Hume correctly notes that most of our thinking is clouded with this kind of self-interested thinking. These violent passions are either direct or indirect. The direct passions are, for example, fear, hope, desire, joy, as they centered on the directness of our own pleasure and pain, that is, mine or your specific pleasure and pain. It's a personal reaction to something that is going to be a direct reaction in these terms. Considering reactions like love and hate, the moral sentiments here listed, and pride and humility, those are fairly intense as well, as you can really, really hate somebody or you can really, really love somebody. That's differentiated from pride and humility, which can be more indirect and have a lower reactionary drive because they have objects as the focal point. For example, I can be proud of myself, an accomplishment. I can be proud of the work that I created. Finally, going back to the calm passions, which again we may mistake as reason, it is not, but it is a more restrained or tamed sentiment that Hume does later change in his writings to the sentiment of taste. And it is that sense of uniformity. Here again, there's an external object to which we have an emotional response. In this case, it is that shape, form, uniformity, and this may be the driver of individual preferences and wants. So how I use this. Hume scholar John Emmerer states that Hume's ideal is that the violent passions are undesirable as these reactions are reactions, whereas the calm passions are preferable because they are responses that create what in Hume's own language he calls a greater strength of will. In various situations, the strength of will or the sort of cultivated taste can counter or weaken violent reactions. So calm passions can actually maybe be stronger, but it does take some training. According to Emmerer, this for Hume is a matter of maintaining happiness. This actually comes from Emmerer's essay where he talks about philosophy as therapy. And so I think it's applicable to the consultative process with organizations because an individual's happiness often depends on the situation and, for present purposes, that individual's resources. Again, their time, their money, their energy. In fact, Hume's theory may fit a particular kind of need theory. In psychology, the endogenous theory of preferences is applied to businesses, as humans effectively respond to external states of affairs and situations that regard their own sentiments, feelings, emotions of resources, time, money, energy. Further, in the field of neuroscience, Richard C. Shaw notes that Hume has sort of undergone a resurgence because of his claim that reason is not only be a slave to the passions. It's a famous quote from the treatise, and there's a realization now that there's a lot of emotional regulation at play in the workplace. For Hume, these emotions can be drilled down to four basic moral sentiments of pride, humility, love, and hate, as we've discussed or mentioned. It is important for Hume to talk about general agreements of sentiments to explain why there are agreements even on rules or about how resources are distributed and the like. To simply say there's just a one-size-fits-all sort of rule approach is going to be a mistake for Hume. Yet the idea that we're really at the mercy of our sentiments, passions, emotions may make it impossible to even achieve these agreements, even in process improvement efforts. So in consulting and considering how people actually work together, before achieving teamwork, people come into work and work as themselves for themselves. All varieties of need theory, all the language of love, hate, pride, humility falls in this level of self-interest. According to Hume, when people come together, they will organize And though it may be odd to discuss property as related to justice and allegiance here, the property conversation is needed to elucidate the connection between self-interest, sentiment, passions, and again, these resources. So this slide, again, here's the change. This is one of the things I actually use in training. I'll explain just a little bit before I go on in reading. I use a fairly standard lean process improvement training during my larger facilitation. And so I have to walk them through various principles. And this is an example of what one of those slides look like. And if you're familiar with lean, you're going to see a couple of these slides throughout the hour here. But first principle, we talk about pull scheduling versus push. And establishing the large goals and then framing out a day-to-day. And let me explain that in the context of the paper here. So as people argue about resources, that is how much money you have or how much time they have or how much energy they have to do a task, those are the things that trigger moral sentiments of love, hate, pride, humility, joy, fear, hope, desire, etc. So with that, during the consultative process, one needs to be really cognizant that if it's resources are the primary concern, then those resources need to be looked at to see how people are managed. So as I often do a process improvement training embedded in my facilitation or my consultative process, the first thing to look at is the voice of the customer. Take the first thing that customers want and work a process backwards to create what's called a pull schedule instead of a push schedule. Essentially, take a customer's timeline, work it backwards until you fill the schedule forward for them. Potentially, you may actually create breathing room for your employees. The first time this exercise is run, it's a disaster because people just work according to the standard timeline set, quote unquote, by management. And it's ostensibly for resource purposes. So quick side note, when we do this in a room, I scatter everybody and tell them, here's your job. I don't care how you really do it, but you got to generate as much product as possible. And I give them a time frame and I give them an amount to hit. And I don't explain to them even what counts as a good product or a bad product. And I know you're probably thinking that's horrible training. It's part of the training. So this exercise then highlights how current efficiency only models create bottlenecks, put employees into stress, and then they react out of those violent and moral passions towards management. One of the things when I say this is usually a train wreck or a disaster, when we run this exercise, one of two things happen, and it's usually humorous, but either people start laughing because it's horrible, they can't accomplish the goal, or they start sort of playfully yelling at each other to move faster, do more, do something. And in the debrief, what I find fascinating is every time I've done this, everyone says, and that's what real life is like. This is how they actually feel at work and many times. So, while this has been a lean example or exercise example, when consulting with a regional financial institution CEO, this is his problem. He said he didn't really want to do process improvement initiatives because he knew what lean meant. And he says it means less employees are needed. And that's not what he wanted, right? He wanted to make sure he kept his people employed. Unfortunately, in an efficiency-only model that doesn't really strive for sustainability of the organization or resources or people, it does look like a numbers-only model, with money being the only metric we can use. So naturally, then, lean would seem to necessitate the elimination of human capital. Yet, the contention here is that property is not just money, it's also other resources like time and energy. So there are other ways to redistribute resources like time and energy and output. And that is by altering time schedules, for example, can increase the output of resources and time and energy that are more effective. Now, after I run this, I add this additional slide to take it from just the exercise in the facilitation to talk about what that real life looks like for them. So during this embedded facilitation, there are these points we outline in terms of lean, and then the case study here centers on a facilitation that I actually ran with an organization. It's a nonprofit this past fall. When the exercise was conducted, I follow up and I ask everyone involved, what is a process at work that you want to improve right now? And I tell them very clearly when we run this part of the exercise that I may not actually address this at all throughout the rest of the training. But I want to know what it is that is sort of on the front of their mind. And I'm going to put it in the quote unquote parking lot. So I usually write it down on a whiteboard or chalkboard. And then again, I may or may not mention this the rest of the day. And the reason I do this is the thing that surfaces, there's always a uniformity of, oh, this is our problem. I usually do not get different problems. I usually get different people saying, this is the one problem that we're worried about. And in this case study, it was a payroll problem. Everyone there knew that it was a problem either for themselves or other people, that payroll wasn't rolled out efficiently, effectively, on time, etc. And that is something that they wanted to fix. And so I would ask them, well, how do you feel about that current process? I don't want to know how the process works. I want to know what sentiment, what passion, what emotion is triggered when you think about how this current process works. And it usually, right, is the violent, direct, this impacts my direct paycheck. This is a violent reaction of emotion, of passion. And again, even though I don't ask them what to change, I want them to think about what in the future could feel different if the process weren't improved. And of course, it is a more calm response of, well, they would know things were working. They would feel, they would believe that their needs are met. Again, referring either to Maslow or the endogenous theory of needs, that's what they're looking for. I need basic needs met. And so these are often things that are a concern for all the parties involved, whether they're staff and or management. So as we move from that sort of resource conversation, we go into what I call sort of a social awareness, which is understanding the rules that govern the resources of time, money, and energy within the organization. In Hume's language, this is exactly what justice is. It's the rules that oversee the distribution of resources. It is noted in the treatise that there are two foundations for justice: self-interest, right, concern about my individual resources, which can be my property in terms of time, salary, wage, etc. Then Hume says the second foundation is moral approval, which he at this point says is found in the language of sympathy. Technically, he's not wrong, but he's likely linguistically wrong. In the treatise, he says that sympathy is the mechanism by which another's pleasure or pain is communicated to myself. Correctly understood, I think he really means empathy. Regardless, sympathy does, in his view, allow for us to feel for other people as ourselves. Essentially, when one of us realizes rules work for more than just me, but for the group of us, then that feeling is communicated and shared across the board. In the inquiry, though, he does change the language to utility in order to make it less confusing regarding how sentiments are communicated. Yet there still remains a confusing question of, well, if we're going to talk about what's best for everyone, what constitutes everyone's approval? This is not the same sort of forward-thinking utility as actually voting for something. This is pre-Bentham, this is pre-Mill, but it is still something that very much determines what benefits all of us. So how does this really work? Clearly, it's not going to be the faculty of reason. Recall, it is a slave of the passions. What reason may do is surface data for the sentiments to make judgments or decisions, but it is those sentiments and emotions that are motivating. Reason does not actually motivate human action and behavior. So this is the primary reason to understand reason as impotent for Hume. Ultimately, again, this is a description for human behavior and action. Determining what is best for everyone is probably going to go through some conflict. But Hume does speculate, or at least there's focus in his language, that we have a propensity towards calm passions and a sense of uniformity and preferences that may be an underlying corrective to conflict. In his philosophical essays, he lauds the principled factions of change over the speculative factions, as they are often, speculative factions are often led by the violent passions and sentiments, whereas principled factions are led by calm passions and taste. And this will come up again. A challenge that we may have towards Hume's descriptive theory is that this view seems to be relativistic, if not outright individualistic. Even in the context of the calm passions, those are individual responses to situations. Sympathy and or utility may help to clarify a sense of connection to others or decisions with respect to others, but it's not clear where that really comes from. In other parts of the treatise, Hume mentions the general point of view or general standards where people tend to agree in some ways and in some places, and he refers to the psychology of custom and habit. Custom and habit works, this language works for discussing human behavior, and it may also be some useful in decision-making, as it is actually the unifying piece to most of all decisions. There's an interesting parallel between organizational structures and behaviors, as well as our thinking based on custom and habit. The idea of utility, to the extent that it works, works. So as long as we're doing something that works, why would we change it? We sort of reify it through custom, habit, and tradition. If that's the case, while it's foundational to sort of gelling teams and organizations, it may also make change really difficult. In his epistemology and descriptive morality, custom and habit are the psychological underpinning for agreeing to general rules of behavior and the general rules of causation even. So here again is Hume's uniformity in the behavior of men. We sort of hit a stopping point of, well, what can we change? In moving from an individual to an organization, employment and organizational structures are supposed to be voluntary structures with the exchange of money for time and services. Moreover, there are political arguments regarding resources, such as budgets between departments and divisions. The budget is a great source of conflict, and people look to the rules to solve those issues. This is really no different than the artificial virtues used in politics. The only difference here is that perhaps just acknowledging the voluntary nature of employment is better than tacit consent underlying most government sort of agreements. And for example, in states with right to work laws, individuals can resign or they can be dismissed. If we wanted to carry this metaphor a little further, we could say that's akin to exile or political exile, if you want to put it that way. But of course, there are some steps that can be taken before completely separating or completely dismantling teams. There are artificial virtues that work in organizations, such as sense of obligation, exchange, fidelity, promise keeping. These sort of keep the social wheels greased for groups. In that regard, systems of organizations that foster truth-telling, promise-keeping, obligations of the like, those benefit everyone and avoid pernicious splits or dismantling. I say pernicious because that was one of Hume's favorite terms as opposed to dangerous. Yes, Lou gets it. So in another round of the training with this airplane or car manufacturing simulation, even if they did make improvements from the first round, the team still has to learn some other things, and we cover the elimination of waste. We go through a Kaizen process. So in the paper here, it says, depending on the model used, it doesn't have to be Kaizen. There are 7 forms of waste. In general, it seems like across the board, there's always seems to be a waste of paper and time and motion and energy. And the upshot then is this implies a waste of resources, not just a waste of money only. Sorry, I just got on the wrong page. I apologize for that. And this waste is sometimes actually dictated by the policy. Again, that's just how things work. It's the traditional status quo. And it is often an old and unquestioned policy, but again, is more efficient to follow it than to stop and address the conflicts and issues within the system. So we sort of coach ourselves to that level of success, or rather unsuccess. So again, talking to a colleague, speaking with an acquaintance about their job outside of one of my own consultations, they mentioned the issues in the intake of patients. They're a veterinarian, so it's actually the intake of a dog patient. And in this practice, everyone knows how it's done, quote unquote. We all know how to do this at the hospital. But when you talk to the people, they know radically different things about the process. So a person at the front desk knows how the patient, the dog, is taken from the very beginning from the customer up until a certain point, and that's usually a handoff. The veterinary technician working on that patient may know actually the most because they're often the ones that have gone from the taking it from reception all the way back to a vet, and they see the more complete side of the process. But even the vet has a completely different sense of how the process works and what that means for all the people involved. This acquaintance could acknowledge, well, we all know we need to fix this process, but I don't think any one person could walk me through the process in the right way or know what to change. This is what cemented custom and habit looks like, and that's why it's hard to change. And even if you identify sources of waste, all the voices have to be heard to eliminate all those sources of waste. So going back to my parking lot question with my facilitation in the payroll example, I follow up and I actually say, so tell me about the problem. What do you think really needs to change? And it's a fascinating exploration because one of the things that surface is why there's conflict. No one has the same perception of the thing that needs to change. They all agree that the thing needs to change, in this case, payroll, that they have different perceptions of it. Some think that the payroll specialist is not doing their job. Some think the person is just doing it wrong. Some think new technology and software will fix everything, right? Which is great if your concern is about waste of paper and time and motion and energy, all of that. So same problem and half a dozen different perspectives. Solutions exist. And additionally, there's no agreement on what to change. To get beyond the language of allegiance in Hume's language, we're going to do a code switch to language about regulations, policy, procedure, and processes that reify the rules of justice in an organization. That's probably the safest way to address this, what I call situational management. In instances where everyone has said, we need to have change, there even has to be small changes of those. There's no change at all. In the consultative process, with a colleague of mine, it's referred to as the 3% change. Because it means even if you don't make a wholesale change, you can still make a shift in of 3 minutes or 3 degrees or 3 feet, and it's better than nothing. But still, it is hard to discern what is the thing that needs to change. So how do you actually accomplish this? Even though there may be different versions of perceiving how the use of resources, time, money, and energy can be changed, there's something else also preventing this change. To be fair, Hume actually does support a fair amount of status quo, which can sound like conservatism rather than support for change. Yet the 3% change approach can lockstep with Hume in that whatever change takes place has to take place within the confines of what he would call the Constitution. So the change isn't a full dismantling of the organization. It is a how can we make corrections within the organization, right? How can we do this within existing policies, procedures, and processes? One way to look at that is that common knowledge. To look at this is that common knowledge of knowing what to do when things work. So in a manner of speaking, it is precisely the way it ought to be insofar as it works. So in the is-ought dilemma, real quick, if you're not up to speed on Hume, right, it's a fallacy of, well, this is the way it is, so it's the way it ought to be. Or in a traditionalist manner, it's the way it's always been, so why shouldn't it stay the same way? And there's a lot more that we could say about the is-ought fallacy or the is-ought dilemma, but it is not the case that just because is implies ought, right? There's actually some other things that happen. My concern here for how people think through process changes in organizations is that, well, it's working, or we think it's basically working, so why would we even think there's a reason to change anything? So the drawback to this approach is the cost of quality to a customer. If it is determined that a plane doesn't work well because it crashed, that's the wrong time to say, I think we have a problem. Right. Once the plane's crashed is the wrong time to say maybe it's not working. Effectively, people tend to fall back on a sort of practical logic, and that's what Hume pushed against, because there's more psychology of custom and habit than actual logic at work. Even then, Hume did have issues with the certainty, quote unquote, of deductive logic. In a manner of speaking, numbers do generate lots of answers, but do they generate the right sorts of answers if it's numbers only? And that seems to line up pretty well with an efficiency only model in organizational structures. While Hume is not generally interested in developing moral oughts, he is quite adept at explaining moral judgment and choice. Moreover, he thinks he can explain how individuals change their mind or adjust their original decisions or judgment. Working from the treatise, the answers developed in the work of sympathy and calm passions. Of course, all of this is removed in the inquiry, but that could be a mistake in the larger context of explaining behavior. Hume drops this initial language because of the reception and repercussions of having made the bold claim, reason is and not only be a slave to the passions. That was not received well by much of the 18th century. So he assuaged attitudes and fears by switching to the use of the term utility to cover up the work of reason and the relationship of judgment and approval and disapproval by sentiment. It was an intelligent move, but fails to account for the individual work of the disinterested spectator. What is discussed in the inquiries is something like a magistrate, who, when there are problems regarding property, right, we go to the magistrate to make the rules to see that the rules of justice are followed. He or she has no particular interest in who may win a property dispute, but the magistrate is definitely motivated, so it's a sentiment motivation, to see the rules adhered to and followed. By sentiment, this makes sense and explains the quote-unquote third-party nature of the adjudicator, but it fails to be translated into individual decision-making and judgment. The difficulty in reading and applying anything in Hume's philosophy and his own adherence to descriptive philosophy. For anything near a prescriptive approach, readers must delve into his essays, those between the treatise and inquiry. There's a lot of prescriptive view of social political change in the essays, grounded in language sounding like social progress. Additionally, though, this resonates with the correction of sentiment by a fixed or general steady point of view. In fact, this may serve as the quote-unquote prescriptive basis for the disinterested spectator. For the consultative process, the analogous point is there may be cultural corporate drivers for change, but this does require either analogous disinterested spectator or something else. So in the next round of simulations, we talk about actual defects in product development, shipment. We're trying to improve their processes overall. And what I challenge them to do is to get beyond this. So people often look at processes as, okay, how can we improve them, assuming that what we have now, right, already works. The challenge that I give to them at this point is, no, I want you to actually make it worse. Take your existing process, and I want you to think of how to make it 100 times worse for your customer, client, or whoever it is you're serving. This is done because when people look at things to make them better, the brain already assumes there's a uniformity in the process that's established. So they're not making significant changes. The desire here, in some sense, is to confront that and to get people to genuinely find new problems. And if they actually go looking for the problems, they will see them. Case in point, in training a local credit union, going through some pretty significant changes recently, this exercise showed them they were missing big pieces in the new building process they were going through. So there are multiple ways to surface problems of conflict. In the late 90s, a colleague of mine who was being belted for Six Sigma, which was already relatively new, wasn't completely new. And he said to me, it's a pretty good system, but it also depends on what numbers you use. If I wanted to, I could prove to you that this work team will perform better if we put a goose in the middle of the room with them. Now, he was being facetious, but of course, it's a matter of, well, what's being measured and how are we using that for decision-making and managing? Because in terms of numbers, it's a matter of probability. This is Hume, right? It's not certainty. You achieve a higher probability, but within the confines of small probability, that something goes wrong. The problem induction says, well, maybe it can go wrong. So people should look at processes as routing out biases, or the bias of just because it works most of the time doesn't mean it's right to do all the time. And these arguments tend to be the source of most conflicts. Going back to my nonprofit payroll issue, I go and I ask them, so if you know this is the problem and everyone's in agreement, why haven't you changed it? Usually when they bring up a problem like this, they've known it's been a problem for months. So if you've known it, you've got ideas, why didn't you actually do it? For example, you could have fired the payroll specialist. If you knew the answer, why didn't you act on it? there's something actually holding them back. And here's a bit of a critique of Hume, is that being set by custom and habit, how do you make changes within the framework of custom and habit? So even Hume pushes for approaches such as being disinterested or referring back to a general common point of view. It's still often in support of the existing set of rules, as they apparently benefit everyone. In essence, his concern is that only the rules are supported. There may not be anyone trying to make the system actually better for themselves, and certainly not trying to make it better for anybody else. It's a vague attempt to make the system better for everyone by just supporting the current system. And most people have coached themselves to that level of work, to the organizational detriment. As a result, the next challenge comes as a matter of hard cases or situations of rule skepticism. Hard cases is where there's no easy decision truly. And in rule skepticism, there's no certainty that existing policies, procedures, processes will be of any assistance in decision-making. The heading here on the slide is really Kierkegaardian sort of language, this term of passionate reason, but I think it does work with Hume in terms of not endorsing strict rationality. Sentiment isn't rational, strictly speaking, and compassion and taste or calm passions may serve as better alternatives to making improvement decisions. Sentiment might be needed to override disinterest, in particular talking about things like hard case dilemmas, which might be akin to something like right versus right dilemmas. In essence, the consultative process regarding improvement has been an effort to get them to get to a level of skepticism and never just to sit back and say, oh, I know the answer. Quick answers are often wrong. A good skeptic will find an answer and then put it into action to test it. There will not be any certainty prior to that. Problematically, when using taste and calm passions does not negate the issues of the general point of view because it's about pleasure, and that goes to utility. Ultimately, the question is whose pleasure and whose utility will we use? For Hume, this judicious spectator is really there to support the official virtues that are already there, and any individual is not partial to anyone. Resolution or dispute, change, or conflict is really trying to be partial to the existing rules only. With concerns of skepticism and rule skepticism in hard cases, we have to be open. There may be something else that could be wrong. And the general point of view may not always be the answer, and the efficiency model may not always be the answer. The disinterested spectator who is called upon to adjudicate disputes over rules of justice must fulfill two requirements. She must first be uninterested in who benefits in the decision. And secondly, she must be solely interested in the adherence to the rules. With this model, individuals see the decision maker must ascertain all of the facts, but sentiment will still make the final decision. The only rule to follow is decided in utility, not speculations. What is set up then is a battle of desire against reason and rationality, or it simply doesn't exist. If self-interest is eliminated, reason does not remain behind. Even if reason did remain behind, it doesn't motivate human behavior and human action. That is the realm of self-interest and sentiment. And so these are what we must kind of go through to get to Hume's language of strength of mind. So there's a quote supposedly attributed to Hume that says, truth springs from disagreement among friends. Can't ever actually find that quote, but it does sort of fit his general theme that truth as a useful artificial virtue, as well as promise keeping, does seem to start resolving some issues of conflict and of self-interest and sentiment. As they are, sorry, I lost my place again, as they do have sentiment at their base, but they also motivate human action without reference to rules. You don't actually have to have these, even if they're not natural virtues. And again, that's a whole side conversation. So for Hume, the issue of arbitrariness or degrees of uncertainty in decisions, as noted in his third appendix to the second inquiry, he says, if direct laws and precedents be wanting, imperfect and indirect ones are brought in. And the controverted cases is ranged under them by analogical reasonings and comparisons and similitudes and correspondencies, which are often more fanciful than real. So this becomes an act of imagination more than act of reason. With respect to subjects like organizational politics or regulations, Hume looks to the factions of individuals or groups of individuals and their established practices for explanations instead of law. And so it sort of separates himself from positivist views. Again, the speculative interest or factions are those grounded in superstition or violent passions, whereas the enlightened principled ones mirror calm passions and taste. And Hume sees these as the ones that he approves of in his essays, these principled factions. So the hard case is then, if you can't get an answer from a set rule because it simply doesn't exist, you're back to having to find out that the preference given is often founded more on taste and imagination than any solid argument. In this section, Hume is discussing really the machinations of law and politics, but it is also the basis of real organizational change. Consider that nearly any decision is founded more upon taste and imagination than argument. This appears to be the root and result of Hume's own descriptive skepticism. Perhaps then his essays on happiness that Imrar referenced earlier are less about happiness in Hellenistic philosophy and more about what these Hellenistic schools represent and how one thinks with respect to taste and imagination and change. That is to say, a reading of those 4 essays as a commentary on various biases may be enlightening for the treatise and the inquiry and change initiatives. This consistent line of thought missing from Hume's lexicon may be his exploration of biases is rooted in sentiment, personality, and his own perceptions of happiness. So let's skip ahead real quick. Actually, we're here. We're getting close to done. I apologize. I think I'm running a little long. The importance of this approach stems from the fact that for Hume, reason doesn't motivate actions or decisions. Only the passions do this. When people are calm, however, it can give the appearance that someone is reasonable and unaffected by emotions. Descriptively, Hume is correct in saying that it's only appearance and reason does not make the final decision. Strength of will, as Hume calls it, is what overpowers or overrides violent passions. The question is how that's accomplished. Not unexpectedly, Hume states that something like time and distance help cool the violent passions, and he notes things like the general rules can influence judgment. That is, imagination adheres to general rules, though we're not offered a definition of what these rules and views are. Hume's descriptive philosophy is insightful, but its lack of normative system seems like it renders it virtually useless. Throughout the treatise, Hume uses terminology such as common violent passion, sympathy, and abandons those. The existing possibility for a solution of conflict through the strength of will may be more like a general point of view based on shared experience rather than mere rule support. Arguments over rules tend to be conflicts of self-interest. When individuals share experiences, it is easier for sentiment and taste to align. This may even have something to do with Hume's own view on commerce and how the arts are refined through trade with other countries. That is, more experience are shared and more understanding of the general public goodwill is generated as delineated in the second inquiry. Another colleague shares the results of his own simulations from a number of years ago. He began doing a lot of detailed accounting in his training because he wanted to highlight one particular thing. As he developed his exercise, he knew there would be one part of the simulation where one person would always fail and there would be a bottleneck in the process. So as participants would go through the exercise, they would always highlight this person as not cutting it, not pulling his weight, and so on. And in facilitating this team, they would always suggest, let's get rid of this guy. And they would have had enough people just they could have fired, quote unquote, fired him and brought someone else in. As a result, they would swap positions with another person just to make a change. But when they would run the exercise again, thinking that the person was the failure, they found out it was still a bottleneck. They realized it wasn't the person, but it was the process that was the problem. And this mistake came from thinking the processes worked from agreed upon rules and numbers. And it highlighted that even significant changes like firing a person would solve a problem in the process. So finally, returning to the payroll example at the end of my consultative process, we review it one more time. And understanding the difference between individual needs and how allocation of time, money, and resources and energy are handled moving forward, the group dynamic organizational rules relative to having a structure alongside personal needs and habits and behaviors forces the group to think through how things can be done. People need to individually think about their personal role in the process and what they can do to create a small, sustainable change. This must be the action plan. Annette Beyer states in her book, Progress of Sentiments, a note regarding Hume, that people cannot change their own nature. We can't change who we are, but people can change their situation. This language is powerful insofar as many people think character is the only thing that must be improved in many cases, and that certainly is always room for improvement, but we can also center this on improving situations for people. This approach requires something that is not just self-interested as a natural motive, but a corrective initial sympathy bias. In our example, a sympathy with this payroll specialist in the position or where it falls in the process shows that termination or replacement is not the only answer. In fact, the solution with this group turned out to be a change in the timelines for the payroll process. Upon this final evaluation, a new person would not have been any more successful in their current system. The current system only allowed for a part-time position with offset hours to everyone else, and no one could have been successful in that role, regardless of new software technology. So in conclusion, in organizational consulting, the individual is part of a collective whole, which fits Hume's description of a naturally self-interested person in our official world. That is, quote unquote, government, politics, society in general. The description of the emotional reaction a person has to experience ties directly to their artificial virtues of property as resources and the rules or formal procedures of governing an organization. Further, language regarding what we would call an allegiance or political change or meaningful organizational change in the philosophical move towards considering the disinterested spectator allows for individuals to review policies, procedures, and processes in their organizational change initiatives. I would contend that rather than just supporting policies, procedures, and processes, genuine sympathy or sincerity or shared experience with others and supporting people over processes drives actual change. And that should conclude it. That was long. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for, in several ways, for firstly reminding us that philosophical practice is not confined to counseling, although counseling is a large part of what practitioners do. It's by no means the whole of what we do. So you've reminded us that it's indeed desirable and possible to work well with organizations, which many of us do as well. And also for, I think in a surprising way, introducing Hume into the context, especially coming from someone who professes Christian ethics to bring the infidel into play. That's very refreshing. And someone who's aligned pretty much with British empiricism, I really appreciate what you've done with Hume. So thank you for that. I'd like to switch the view to full so we could all give you a round of applause for a tremendous talk. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
And welcome to our friends from the West Coast who are just joining, and from India, Vala, I know you're in Jamaica, but you're still Indian, and Raja from India, and our friends from the West Coast. I see Regina, I know Barbara's here, Jessica's here. Thank you so much for joining.